The hunter's horn split the afternoon air before Tobias even saw her. He had been kneeling at the edge of the Vethara River, filling his waterskin after a long morning checking the eastern hives, when something enormous crashed through the undergrowth upstream and landed in a half-crouch not 10 feet from him. His heart lurched so hard he nearly dropped the skin entirely, and his hand flew instinctively toward the short knife on his hip before his eyes caught up with what he was actually seeing. She was not a bear, she was not a wildcat. She was an orc woman, lean and tall and radiating the kind of danger that made the small hairs on his arms stand straight up, and she was staring at him with eyes the color of deep moss after rain, calculating and wild and furious all at once. Her skin was a warm gray-green in the dappled light, her lower tusks small and curved and white as river pebbles, and she wore close-fitted warrior's leathers, a laced bodice of dark brown hide that hugged her torso, matching breeches tucked into knee-high boots, a short braided belt hung with small pouches and a sheathed hunting blade. Her black hair was loose, half escaped from a braid that had clearly seen better days, sticking to her jaw and neck with sweat and forest debris. She was the most vivid thing Tobias Graves had ever seen in his life, and the expression on her face said she was deciding very quickly whether he was a threat. "Human," she said, low and even like the word itself was a test. "Yes," he said, equally low because the horns were getting louder. Her eyes cut upstream, then back to him, and he saw the calculation running behind them like water over stone, fast and precise. "How many hides can you hold your breath?" "Excuse me." "The waterfall," she said, and her head jerked toward the cascade 30 yards downstream where the Vethara dropped off a limestone ledge in a white curtain of noise and mist. "Behind it, is there space?" He had swum this stretch since he was a boy. He knew every ledge and hollow of it. "Yes," he said, "a shelf behind the main fall, wide enough for 2 people maybe." Something shifted in her face, not softness exactly, more like a lock clicking open a single turn. "Then we are going behind it," she said, and she reached out and grabbed his wrist. Not his sleeve, not his coat. His wrist with a grip like iron wrapped in warm leather, and she pulled him toward the water with such absolute authority that his feet followed before his brain had formally agreed to the plan. "Who are they?" He managed as they waded in, the cold biting straight through his trousers. "Hunters," she said, "not the kind that hunt animals." The current caught him at the knee, and he steadied himself with his free hand, but she moved through the chest-deep water like she had been built for it, sure-footed on the slick bottom, pulling him along and never once letting go of his wrist. The roar of the falls grew until it swallowed everything, and the mist turned the air white and wet, and Tobias had one breathless, drowning second of "oh, this is actually happening" before she pulled him under the curtain of falling water and they surfaced together on the far side, gasping onto the limestone shelf. It was barely lit back here. The falls hung in front of them like a moving wall of silver and white, and the sound was enormous, a physical pressure in the chest. The shelf was real, just as he remembered, wide enough to stand on, maybe 4 feet of depth between the falls and the rock face, the stone worn smooth and slightly cupped by centuries of spray. They stood pressed close in the cramped space, both of them soaked to the skin, and Gromma Rageborn still had his wrist in her hand. She had not let go. He could feel her pulse against his, or maybe it was his own. Hard to say. The spray was ice cold and he was shivering already, and she was scanning the visible wedge of river through the falls with those dark green eyes, every muscle in her body taut as a drawn bow. "Be very quiet," she said, just above the roar, her mouth close to his ear. "I wasn't planning to be loud," he whispered back. Through the white curtain he caught glimpses of color on the far bank. 2 men, then 3, moving along the water's edge with crossbows slung at their sides and a long piece of tracking parchment that one of them held spread between his hands. They were bounty hunters, unmistakably. The gilt pins on their collars caught the light even through all that falling water, silver circles stamped with crossed arrows. They moved methodically, scanning the banks, and Tobias held very, very still. Gromma's grip on his wrist tightened for just a moment, and then she let out a slow, controlled breath and stood like stone. The hunters passed on by. The parchment man consulted it once, shook his head, and the three of them moved upstream toward the crossing ford, their voices lost in the waterfall's thunder. Tobias counted to 100 in his head before he breathed normally again. Then he turned and looked at Gromma Rageborn properly for the first time. She was looking at him too. She had, he realized, not let go of his wrist the entire time. Now she noticed it as well, and her eyes dropped to where her hand circled his arm, and she released him with a deliberateness that felt almost reluctant. "You did not run," she said. "Run where? You were between me and the bank." A corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the cousin of one. "The other way, upstream, you could have shouted." "I thought about it," he admitted. "But you did not." "No," he met her gaze. "I did not." Something passed between them in the cave of noise and mist and cold, something that did not have a name yet but was real and solid as the limestone under their boots. She studied him for a long moment with those water-green eyes, water streaming down her face, her braid completely lost now, her black hair hanging in dark ropes over her shoulders. "I am Gromma," she said at last. "Gromma Rageborn, warrior of the Veth clan." A pause. "Formerly." "Tobias Graves," he said. "Beekeeper, currently and probably forever." Another pause. "Why are they hunting you?" Her jaw set. "That is a long story." "We appear to have some time," he said, and looked out at the falls and the empty river beyond and the afternoon light turning gold in the spray. She considered him for another long moment as though deciding whether he had earned the answer. "I am accused of theft," she said. "From Harwick Combe, the factor at Dunridge Post." Her voice went flat in the way that voices go flat when a person is furious and working very hard to contain it. "I took nothing from him." But a rage-born warrior in a border town without a clan at her back makes a convenient target for a man who wants someone to blame for his own missing silver. "Combe," Tobias said, and something cold moved through him that had nothing to do with the spray. "Harwick Combe. Heavy-set man, always wears a waxed coat." She looked at him sharply. "You know him." "He bought 3 seasons of my honey at below market rate and then refused to pay the difference he promised me, and when I argued it, he had me put out of the post." Tobias felt the old bitterness rise and swallowed it back down. "He's been cheating traders on this frontier for years. Everyone knows it. No one does anything because he has guild affiliation and they don't." Her eyes narrowed slowly, not with suspicion, with something more complicated. "You are a man who knows the taste of being wronged by him." "Yes." "Then you understand why I am here and not quietly accepting the charge." "Yes," he said again. And then, because it was true, "For what it is worth, I believe you." The silence stretched between them, thin and strange. And then the sound of the waterfall came rushing back as though it had been muffled for a moment. Gromma Rageborn looked away, out through the white curtain, and the line of her jaw was fierce and proud and something else underneath, something he was not practiced enough at reading to name yet. "We should not stay here long," she said. "The cold will take us before the hunters find us." "I live a quarter-mile south," he said, "through the fern wood. I have a hearth." She looked at him sidelong. "That is not an attempt at anything," he said, because he was not an idiot and he understood what it meant for an orc woman alone to accept the hospitality of a human man she had met 20 minutes ago. "That is me saying there is warmth and dry clothes if you want them. I'll sleep in the hive barn if it makes you more comfortable." She stared at him for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "No one sleeps in a hive barn in their own home. That is ridiculous. I meant it as an option. It is a poor option." She looked away again, and this time he was almost certain the corner of her mouth had moved again, and this time it was closer to a smile. "Show me the quarter-mile, Tobias Graves." They slipped out from behind the falls and waded back to shore in the long golden light of late afternoon. And if she stayed closer to him on the bank than strictly necessary, neither of them said anything about it. Tobias Graves' homestead was not impressive by any standard that mattered to the wider world. It was a long, low-roofed house of fieldstone and timber with a good chimney, and a kitchen hearth large enough to roast a sheep. And outside it stood the hive yard, 22 hives in hand-cut cedar boxes arranged in 2 careful rows. The bees gone quiet for evening, the whole yard smelling richly of warm wax and clover, even in the late-season cool. There were the 6 sheep grazing the south paddock, the small vegetable patch now going to seed, the root cellar half sunk into the hillside, and the big hive barn where he pressed comb and rendered wax and spent most of his waking life. Gromma stopped at the edge of the yard and looked at the hives. "You tend bees," she said, as though she had not quite absorbed this earlier. 22 colonies, he said. "I sell the honey at Greenford Market and the wax to the chandlers in Dunridge, a beat. Or I used to, before Combe blacklisted me from the post." She looked at him. "How do you sell it now?" "Cart, 30 miles to Greenford directly." He tried to say it without bitterness and mostly succeeded. "It takes 3 days and eats half the profit in road tolls." She made a sound that was not quite a word, just a low noise of recognition, as if she were filing this information in a place she intended to revisit. Then she followed him inside. The hearth fire was banked low but caught quickly when he fed it, and he hung the kettle and dug out dry clothes, his own spare shirt and a heavy wool blanket because he had nothing in her size, and pointed her toward the back room where he kept the wash basin. She emerged 20 minutes later in the oversized shirt, and the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her wet warrior's leathers draped over the drying rack, and she looked utterly unbothered by the absurdity of the outfit in a way that made Tobias quietly, unexpectedly charmed. He made tea and thick bread with honey, his own honey, dark and heady from the late summer heather, the best batch of the year, and they sat at the table and ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which surprised him. Most silences in his life were the kind that reminded him how alone he was. This one felt like something being built rather than something missing. "Tell me about the charge exactly," he said when the tea was half gone. She told him. It was, as he had suspected, straightforward theft. Combe claimed she had taken 40 silver marks from his factor's strongbox while in the post buying trail supplies. 2 of his employees had signed statements to the effect, which meant the bounty hunters had a warrant. Gromma had been 2 days' ride from Dunridge when she heard the horns for the first time and had been moving through the Vethara forest ever since, trying to get to the Rageborn clan grounds in the Deep Highland, which was sovereign territory and beyond any border bounty warrant. "How far is clan territory?" Tobias asked. 3 days if I move fast, 5 if I try to hide." Her jaw tightened. "The bounty hunters ride. I cannot outrun horses through open country." "No," he agreed, "but you do not have to go through open country." She looked at him across the rim of her cup. "I know the forest routes," he said. "I've run hives in the highland margin for years. There are paths the hunters won't know, not roads, not tracks, just game trails I've been using since I was a boy. I know where the ridgeline opens out to forest all the way to the Goreth Highlands." He paused. "I could take you." "Why," she said, quietly and with great precision, "would you do that?" He had been expecting the question and still found it harder to answer than he liked. Not because he did not know the answer. Because saying it out loud to a woman he had met 3 hours ago felt like bearing something private. "Combe wronged me," he said at last. "And from what you are telling me, he is now doing worse to you. That bothers me." He turned his cup in his hands. "And I think you did not deserve any of this. And I think—" He stopped. "Say the whole thought," she said. He looked up. "I think you must be very tired," he said, "of carrying this alone." The silence after that was not like the earlier one. It was charged with something, live and warm in the air between them, and Gromma Rageborn's eyes were doing something he could not entirely read, which was to say they were doing something very complex for someone who had seemed so unreadable an hour ago. "I am, in fact," she said after a moment, "quite tired of that." "Then let me come with you." She looked at him for a long count of seconds. "If you guide me to Rageborn territory," she said slowly, "and the hunters track you for it, you will inherit my trouble. They will know your face. Combe will know what you did." "I have not been welcome at Dunridge Post for 2 years," he said. "There is very little Combe can do to me that he has not already done." Something lit in her eyes deep down, not quite warmth yet, more like a banked coal aware of itself. "You are a strange man, Tobias Graves." "I have been told," he agreed. She drained the rest of her tea. "We leave at first light," she said. "I will not wait for the hunters to triple back." "First light," he said. "I need 2 hours in the morning to check the hives and leave them secured. They need checking before a long absence." She nodded, as though a man requiring time to secure his bees before fleeing into the forest with a fugitive warrior was entirely reasonable, and he found that he liked this about her very much. He gave her the bed without discussion and slept on the settle near the hearth, wrapped in his second blanket, and lay awake for an unreasonable amount of time listening to the forest quiet and thinking about the grip of her hand on his wrist. He was up before dawn. The bees were calm, the night still and cool, and he worked through the hives methodically in the early gray light, closing entrances to their winter width, checking the last of the stores, setting the water channels and the board covers against hard rain. It was the work of 2 hours done in calm focus, which was the only kind of focus he had when he was in the hive yard, because bees rewarded calm and punished everything else, and he had learned this young. Gromma appeared at the yard's edge when he was on the 19th hive. She had dressed again in her own leathers, dried now, if still slightly stiff, and she stood watching him with her arms crossed and an expression of undisguised curiosity. "They do not sting you," she observed. "Not often," he said. "You have to move slowly and breathe slowly. You have been doing this your whole life. Since I was 12, he moved to the next hive. My grandfather kept bees. I watched him when I was small. After he died, I took over the yard. I had no one left to inherit anything else, and the bees needed tending." She was quiet for a moment. "Your family is gone. All gone." He said it without self-pity because he had said it enough times that it was simply true. "Years back. My mother, then my father, then my grandfather the spring after. Fever and time, that's the frontier for you." He closed the last hive lid and turned to face her. "I have had the homestead and the bees and the sheep, and that has been enough." She looked at him, and he had the disconcerting feeling that she was seeing not just him but the shape of his loneliness, the exact dimensions of it, the way a skilled warrior reads terrain. "Has it?" she said, gently, not cruelly. "Not entirely," he admitted. "No." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she nodded. "I know that feeling," she said. "The Rageborn warband fell apart after the last border treaty. Half went to the highland, half to the cities to find work. I have been moving between both and belonging to neither." A pause. "My mother would say that is what I deserve for being too proud to settle. My war captain would say I am too soft to be truly alone." She looked away. "Neither of them are entirely wrong." "Maybe," he said. "You are exactly the right kind of person, and you just have not been in the right place yet." She cut a look back at him, sharp and assessing, as if checking whether he was being sentimental at her expense. He was not. He meant it. She must have seen that, because after a moment her shoulders dropped the faintest fraction and she said, "We should move." They moved. The forest route he knew began behind the hive barn and climbed north through old-growth fern wood, where the trees were ancient and enormous, and the canopy so thick that rain came down in green-filtered drops even in summer. The game paths were narrow, often overgrown, and winding in the particular illogical way of trails made by deer and wild boar over centuries, and he had to navigate by landmarks: a split oak, a cluster of white boulders, a dried stream bed that smelled of iron rather than any proper road sense. He had done it enough times that it lived in his body as much as his head, and he moved without hesitation, Gromma following close and silent at his back. She was, he discovered, an extraordinarily good traveling companion. She moved without noise, noticed everything, and did not fill silence with pointless sound. When they stopped at midday near a slow-moving tributary to drink and eat the bread and salt meat he had packed, She sat easily on a fallen log and pulled out a small polished stone from one of her belt pouches, turning it over in her fingers, and he recognized it as a waystone, a clan-crafted focus stone used for orientation in deep forest, the rune marks on it sensitive to ley lines in the earth. "Can you read direction with that?" he asked. "Northeast from here," she confirmed. "Highland is still bearing true." She glanced at him. "Your path agrees. Good to know I have not been leading us in circles for 20 years. The corner of her mouth again, definite smile territory this time. She turned the waystone and held it toward him, and he took it carefully and felt the faint pulse of it against his fingers, warm in a way that was not body heat. "Keep it out," she said. "Check it each time we stop. You should know how." He looked at her. "You are teaching me to use it. You are guiding me through unfamiliar forest," she said. "It seems fair that I give you something useful in return." He handed it back. "How long have you had it?" "Since my naming ceremony," she said. "When an orc warrior comes of age, the clan shaman marks a stone for them. It is tuned to the highland. As long as I carry it, I know which way home is." She paused. "Even when I have not been home in 3 years." He did not say anything to that. He just looked at her, and she looked back at the stone in her palm, and the tributary ran over its stones with a sound like soft conversation, and the moment settled around them like something that had been waiting to happen. They made camp that night in a hollow between two great root masses, where the ground was dry and sheltered, and Tobias built a fire small enough to give heat without much light. He had done this often enough solo nights in the forest during the long honey runs that the routine was easy, and Gromma watched him set the fire with the same attentive look she had given everything else, cataloging, filing, adjusting her picture of him. "You are comfortable in wild places," she said. "I prefer them," he said. "Markets make me feel like I have done something wrong simply by being there. I know that feeling." She stretched her legs toward the warmth, and the firelight moved across her face and the line of her jaw and the curve of her tusks, and he was aware, very clearly and without drama, that she was beautiful. Not despite anything. Not in spite of the tusks or the gray-green skin or the warrior's bearing. Just beautiful in the way that things built exactly right for their purpose are beautiful, solid and true and made for the world they lived in. He looked at the fire before she could catch him looking. "The Rageborn," she said, "have a saying. The ones who fit nowhere always find each other." She glanced at him sideways. "I thought it was a comfort saying. Something the elders said to make the young ones feel better about being difficult. And now," she was quiet for a moment, "and now I am less certain it is only a comfort." He felt the warmth of that settle in his chest and did not trust himself to answer it correctly, so he said instead, "I'll take first watch. Sleep when you can." She looked at him steadily. "You are not required to protect me, Tobias." "I know," he said. "I want to." Another long look, and then she turned onto her side, her back to the fire, and within 10 minutes her breathing had slowed to the even rhythm of genuine sleep, and he sat awake in the firelight and listened to the night and thought about a lot of things, none of them particularly orderly. The second day went smoothly until mid-afternoon when they crested a rise and Tobias stopped dead. Below them, a quarter-mile down through a scrub break, a group of 5 riders had halted at the crossing of 2 forest tracks. They were too far away to see clearly, but the glint of crossbow fittings and the silver circle of guild pins were unmistakable even at that distance. Not 3 hunters now, 5. "They doubled the warrant," Gromma said, very quietly beside him. "Orcombe paid for more." He eased them both back from the ridgeline. "They are guessing at the highland route. They know you are heading for clan territory. Can we go around them? East. There is a ravine route that adds half a day but keeps us in tree cover the whole way." He was already picturing the terrain. "We would have to move at night for the first section." "I can move at night." "I know you can. It is my eyes I am worried about." "I can see for us both," she said simply. "Orc sight in low light is better than a human's. I will guide us in the dark, you guide us in the day. Fair trade." He nodded. "Fair trade." They held in the cover of the ridge trees until the riders moved south along the lower track, and then slipped east into the ravine. where the walls of limestone rose on either side, and the sound of wind and riders was muffled to nothing. That evening they camped earlier than planned so Tobias could rest before the night section, and Gromma took the first watch without discussion and sat with her knife on her knee and her waiststone in her palm while he slept. He woke to her hand on his shoulder, firm but careful. "Time," she said softly. He came awake fast, he always had, even as a boy, a skill of uncertain value, and sat up to find the forest utterly black beyond the dead fire's ember glow. "Ready," he said. She moved ahead and he put a hand on her shoulder, and she led him through the dark ravine with a certainty that was extraordinary, placing each step, reading the ground by some combination of sight and sense he could not follow, narrating obstacles in a low murmur. "Step up. Duck left. Rock here. Stay right." Her voice in the dark was lower than in daylight and steadier, and he followed it and the warmth of her shoulder under his palm and did not stumble once. It was the strangest 2 hours of his life, and he did not think he had ever felt so led, or so secure in being led by anyone. They came out the far end of the ravine into a faint pre-dawn gray, and Gromma stopped and turned and looked at him with an expression that had something new in it. "You trusted me completely back there," she said. "Yes," he said, "without question. You have not given me a reason for questions." She looked at him for a long time. The light was growing around them, pale and cold, touching the frost on the grass and the curve of her face and the dark of her eyes. "No orc warrior trusts a human that readily," she said, "and no human trusts an orc that readily. Maybe we are both poor examples of our kinds," he said. "Maybe," she said. And she reached out and briefly, deliberately, covered his hand with hers where it rested against his side. The touch lasted only a moment. Then she withdrew it and turned north and said, "Highland before nightfall if we move." They moved. But Tobias carried the warmth of that touch for the rest of the morning, and it did not fade. They came to the border of the Rageborn Highland territory just past midday on the third day, and Tobias knew the boundary not by any marker or fence, but by the shift in the forest itself. The trees older and heavier, the moss thicker, the undergrowth wound through with careful pathways that had been maintained by orc hands for generations. There was a feel to it like entering a room where people had lived for a very long time, dense with history, dense with something that was not quite welcome, not yet, but was also not hostility. 2 orc warriors stepped onto the path ahead of them with the silence of people who had been there for several minutes already. Tobias went still. He had spent his whole life on the frontier edge of orc territory and had never actually been this far into it. And the 2 warriors in front of him were considerably larger than Gromma, and regarded him with expressions that could best be described as reserved displeasure. Gromma spoke before anyone else could. She spoke in the clan tongue, which he did not know, but the tone was clear, direct, unhesitating, the tone of a woman explaining herself to people who were expecting the explanation. One of the warriors' expressions shifted. The others did not shift at all. Then Gromma said something in a different register, still in the clan tongue, but now with a weight and formality that changed the air around her. And she put her hand on Tobias's arm and pulled him slightly forward, and said his name clearly, in the common tongue, and then something else in the clan language that made the first warrior finally change his expression to something approaching consideration. Then she looked at the second warrior and said something very short and very firm, and he stepped aside. Tobias let out a breath. "What did you tell them?" he asked quietly as they passed. "That you are under my protection," she said, "and that you guided me home under a false warrant and kept me alive when you could have handed me over for coin." A pause. "I also told them that you are mine. It was easier than explaining." He looked at her sideways. "You told them I was yours." "In orc terms," she said evenly, looking straight ahead, "it ends arguments faster than a detailed explanation of gratitude." "In orc terms," he said, "yes. What does it mean in orc terms exactly?" A long pause. They walked deeper into the highland, the path widening, the trees opening ahead to where he could see the shapes of hide-covered war tents and long low halls of split timber, smoke from cook fires rising in the still air. "It means," she said at last, with great precision, "that you are someone I would not see harmed." He thought about that. "And that is the same as being yours." She stopped walking and turned and looked at him with an expression he could not fully read, and was increasingly convinced he was going to spend a very long time learning. "Among the Rageborn," she said, "to say that you would not see someone harmed is a profound thing. We do not say it lightly. There is a reason the word we use is the same in both cases." He held her gaze. "Then I am honored," he said quietly, "in any terms." Something moved through her face, quick and real and unguarded, and then she turned away again, back to the path. "Come," she said. "I need to speak to the clan elder, and you need food and a fire." The Rageborn clan elder was a formidable orc woman of middle years named Dora Stoneback, and she received Tobias with the particular brand of neutral assessment that reminded him strongly of a landowner evaluating a horse at market, thorough, unhurried, and presently uncommitted. She heard Gromma's account of the past 3 days through a translator, asked several pointed questions, and then fixed Tobias with a long look. The translator said, "She asks why you helped her." "Because it was right," Tobias said. A pause while this was relayed. Another question from Dora Stoneback. "She asks if you expected something in return." "No," he said. "Nothing." Dora Stoneback looked at him for a moment longer, and then she said something that Gromma translated herself directly, without the translator. She says, "A man who helps for nothing is either a fool or the rarest kind of person. She is willing to believe you may be the latter." "I have occasionally been both," Tobias said. Dora Stoneback laughed. It was a large laugh for a large woman, and it filled the long hall, and after that he was given soup, bread, and a place near the fire, and Gromma sat beside him rather than across from him, which he noticed. The business of the false warrant took 2 days to resolve, at least in principle. Dora Stoneback sent a message rider to the Border Bounty Guild office with a clan elder's formal statement disputing the charge and invoking the border treaty's protections for clan members in good standing, which Gromma still was, technically, even as a wandering warrior. This did not dissolve the warrant immediately. Warrants required a counter-deposition from someone in the common court system, but it put a hold on the active bounty and meant the 5 hunters could not cross the clan boundary to pursue her. It did not, however, resolve the fact that Harwick Combe was still a factor at Dunridge Post with the guild behind him, and that his signed statements were still on record, and that Gromma could not live within the Highland forever without eventually trying to move through the border towns again. And it did not resolve the fact that Tobias had a homestead 3 days' walk south with 22 hive colonies that needed a beekeeper, and that staying in the Highland was not a long-term option for him either. They talked about it on the evening of the 2nd day, sitting outside Dora's hall on a log bench in the cool Highland air, the cook fire smoke drifting past them in pale ribbons. "I have to go back," he said. "The hives." "I know." She had been expecting it. He could tell by the way she did not react. "And you have to stay here for now, until the warrant is settled." "Yes." She turned the waistone in her fingers, the habit of it. "Dora is sending to the Greenford court. It may take weeks." "Weeks I can manage," he said. "I will leave word at Greenford Market that if a deposition is needed I will give one." She looked at him. "You would testify against Combe." "I have 2 years of his accounting practices stored in my head," Tobias said. "I know the dates of every trade he shorted me on. If the court takes a deposition, I will give one that makes the pattern very clear." He paused. "And I know 2 other traders he cheated at the same post. I think they might be willing to speak if they knew someone else was speaking first." Gromma was very still. "That is not a small thing you are offering." "He stole from you and tried to have you imprisoned," Tobias said. "He has been stealing from people on this frontier for years and using the guild to protect himself. I am tired of it." He looked at her. "And I am—" He stopped. "Say the whole thought," she said, exactly as she had said it before under the waterfall in the noise and cold of hiding. He looked at her directly. I am not ready to be done knowing you, he said. That is the honest truth of it. Her hands went still on the waystone. The cook fire smoke drifted between them and cleared again. Tobias Graves, she said, and her voice was lower than usual. You are the most straightforwardly honest person I have ever met. Is that bad? No, she said. It is the opposite of bad. She held the waystone between her thumb and forefinger, and then she held it out to him. Take it, he blinked. That is your naming stone. I know what it is. Gromma, I cannot take it, she said again, and her eyes were serious and very steady. It points to the highland. While you carry it, you will know which way this is, which way I am. A pause. Come back, Tobias. When the deposition is ready, when you have done what you need to do, come back. He took the stone. It was warm, as it always was, with that particular not-quite body heat warmth, and it sat in his palm like a small, steady heartbeat. He closed his fingers around it. I will, he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she reached up unhurriedly, without drama, as though she had decided something and was simply acting on it, and put her hand along his jaw and kissed him. It was a proper kiss, direct and warm and tasting of heather smoke, and it lasted long enough to be entirely serious. When she pulled back, she did not look embarrassed or impulsive. She looked like someone who had done exactly what she meant to do. He was, for a few seconds, not entirely sure how to form words. That, she said calmly, is so you do not forget the direction. I would not have forgotten the direction, he managed. Now you will definitely not forget it, she said, and there was that smile, fully formed this time, and it was a wonderful thing to see. He left the next morning, the waystone in his shirt pocket, close to his sternum where he could feel it when he breathed. The walk back was 3 days alone, which he had made dozens of times in his life, but which had never felt quite this inhabited by someone else's absence. He checked the waystone at each halt, not because he needed directions, but because it was warm in his hand and it meant something. And he was not above admitting that to himself, even if he would not have said it to anyone else. He got back to the homestead to find the hives undisturbed, the sheep restless but fine, and a folded note tucked into the door frame from the Greenford market master asking about next season's honey order. He wrote back that he would be available, and then he spent 3 days in the hive yard and the barn with the singular focus of a man putting his affairs in order, because he was planning to go back north as soon as he possibly could. In between, he did the harder thing. He went to his neighbor Aldrich Vess, who had farmed the next valley over for 20 years and whom Combe had cheated on a grain contract 4 seasons back, and he sat at Aldrich's table and told him what he intended to do and why. Aldrich was a large, quiet man who said almost nothing for the duration of the explanation, and then said, I have been waiting for someone to start. I will sign a deposition. He went to Marrett Halst at the trading post in Fenwick, who had been refused a fair weighing on a bolt-cloth contract. She said, What took you so long? And signed immediately. He wrote both depositions himself, carefully and in plain language from memory, using every date and number he could produce, and had them witnessed at the Fenwick Justice Office, and then he rode to Greenford and gave his own at the circuit court and handed the whole bundle to the court recorder with the clan elder's statement from Dora Stoneback, and the clerk looked at the size of the packet and said, with some respect, This is a considerable body of evidence, sir. Yes, Tobias said. It is. The court recorder stamped the intake seal and told him that a formal inquiry would begin within 30 days. Tobias nodded and rode out of Greenford and turned the horse north. He had been gone 18 days. The waystone was warm against his chest every mile. He was 2 hours out from the clan boundary when he encountered the problem. The 5 bounty hunters had not, it turned out, given up. They had not crossed the clan boundary. The hold on the warrant prevented that, but they had set up camp at the forest edge, just south of the tree line, and they were waiting. When Tobias came down the track toward the trees, 2 of them stepped out into the road, and the third held a crossbow leveled at a careful, technically polite, not quite aimed position. The lead hunter was a wiry man with a narrow face and the look of someone who knew that the road was technically outside the clan's jurisdiction. "Graves," he said. He had clearly done his research on the way home. "You are the man who guided the Rageborn fugitive into clan territory." "I am the man who walked through the forest with someone who has not been convicted of anything," Tobias said. "The warrant is still active, whatever the hold says. You aided and abetted a wanted individual." "The warrant," Tobias said, "is currently under formal inquiry at Greenford Circuit Court, with depositions from 3 witnesses and a clan elder's statement. It will almost certainly be vacated within 30 days. He met the lead hunter's eyes. "If you detain me now, you will be detaining a court witness in an active inquiry, which is a guild offense carrying suspension of license." The lead hunter was quiet. "I know the guild code," Tobias said. "I have had occasion to read it carefully this past week." The crossbow did not lower, but the man holding it looked uncertain. The lead hunter's jaw worked. "You are very sure of yourself for a beekeeper." "I am very sure of the law," Tobias said, "which is different." He held the man's gaze. "I am going to continue up this road now. You can decide what to do about that." A very long silence. The crossbow stayed where it was. Tobias kept his expression level and his breathing even, the way he had learned to do in the hive yard, calm, passing steady and outward, nothing to react to, nothing to alarm. He counted to 10 in his head. The lead hunter stood aside. Tobias went past them without rushing up the track into the trees. It was only when the tree cover closed around him and the hunters were out of sight that his hands, very slightly, began to shake. He pressed one of them flat against his sternum over the waistone and held it there until the shaking stopped. 2 more hours. He moved fast. He was met at the clan boundary by the same 2 warriors as before, and this time they stood aside without discussion, and one of them said something brief that Tobias was fairly certain was a greeting rather than a challenge, and he nodded back with what he hoped was the appropriate gravity. He found Gromma at the edge of the tree line near the highland border, sitting on a boulder with her waistone equivalent. She had carved a small one from highland chalk, which was not tuned but served to fill the hands while thinking, and she looked up when she heard him coming and went very still. Then she stood up, and he reached into his shirt and held out her waistone in his palm, and she looked at it and then at him and said, "You came back." "I said I would. Many people say things." "I don't," he said. "Generally." She crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and took the waistone from his hand and then took his hand as well and held it, looking down at his fingers and then up at his face with an expression that was open in a way she clearly did not usually allow. "Tell me," she said. He told her. All of it, the depositions, the court, the 30-day inquiry, the hunters at the boundary road, and how that had ended. She listened without interrupting, which he had come to understand was a form of respect for her, and when he was done she turned his hand over in both of hers as if reading something in it. "You testified against Combe," she said. "Yes." "And brought 2 more witnesses." "Yes, for me." "For everyone he cheated," Tobias said, "but also, yes, for you." She looked at him for a long time, and then she pulled him, by the hand she was already holding, in close and wrapped her other arm around his back, and it was not a careful or tentative embrace. It was the embrace of someone who had decided something clearly and was acting on it with her whole self, strong and warm and sure, and he put his arms around her and held on, and it felt, very simply and unexpectedly, like arriving somewhere he had not known he was traveling toward. "You are a remarkable man," she said, into his hair. "I am a beekeeper who filed some paperwork," he said. She made a sound against his temple that was part laugh and part something else. "Do not do that. Do not make yourself small." She pulled back just enough to look at him. "You did something real. Let it be real." He looked at her close now, close enough to see the fine texture of her skin and the dark ring around her irises and the small scar along her left cheekbone from some old fight, and he said, "It is real. Every bit of it." She kissed him again, and this time it was longer and deeper, and the highland air was cold around them and her hands were warm on his face, and it felt entirely natural and entirely extraordinary at the same time. Tobias stayed in the highland. It was not, initially, a planned decision. It was simply that there was no urgency pulling him south. The hives were secured, the court inquiry was in motion, the work was done, and there was a very strong pull keeping him north, which was Gromma Rageborn in her warrior's leathers sitting across the fire from him in the mornings, and the particular quality of the highland light at dawn, and the fact that among the Rageborn he was apparently, per Gromma's declaration on arrival, hers, and no one was inclined to question this further. The Rageborn were not an unfriendly people once the initial assessment was cleared. They were practical, direct, loyal, and physically formidable, and they respected competence in any form. When it emerged that Tobias knew the highland flora in detail from years of placing hives in the highland margin, he was approached by the clan's herb keeper with a series of precise and increasingly complex questions about late-season flowering cycles, and he answered them as best he could, and after that he was given a slightly warmer greeting at the cook fire in the mornings. Gromma moved differently in the highland. In the forest she had been coiled, alert, always one edge of her attention outward. Here she loosened, not soft, never soft but less taut, the way a drawn string is when the archer finally lowers the bow. She trained every morning in the open ground near the river, and he watched her sometimes without meaning to, the clean precision of her movements, the way she handled the long-handled training blades with a fluency that made it look effortless and was obviously the opposite of that. One morning she looked up from the training ground and caught him watching, and instead of looking away she waved him over. "Come," she said. "I am a beekeeper," he said. "You carry a knife. You walked this forest for days. You faced down 5 armed hunters on an open road." She held out the training blade. "Come." He came. The training was educational in the same way that being told you have been doing something the wrong way your entire life is educational, humbling, but also clarifying. He was not completely incompetent, which Gromma acknowledged with minimal surprise and maximum standards, and by the 3rd session she was moving slower to account for his pace and calling corrections that were practical rather than dismissive, and he was improving. "You learn quickly," she said one afternoon, stopping a drill mid-movement to correct his grip. "I've had practice learning things I should have been taught earlier," he said. She adjusted his hand on the hilt, her fingers precise and warm. "The bees taught you patience," she said. "Patience is most of this." "The bees taught me that if I panic I get stung, and so does everything around me," he said. "I'm not sure that is the same thing as patience." "It is," she said, and smiled at him from about 8 inches away, and he nearly forgot what they were doing entirely. "You are doing that on purpose," he said. "I do not know what you mean," she said, entirely serene, and stepped back and reset into her opening stance. He had been in the highland for 2 weeks when the situation crystallized, and it crystallized publicly, dramatically, and in a way that Tobias would think about for the rest of his life. A rider came from the border town of Keswick with a message for Gromma Rageborn, delivered under guild flag, which meant it had official standing and had to be received openly. The message was from Harwick Combe. It was, in essence, a formal demand. Combe was countering the court inquiry with his own guild challenge, claiming that the depositions were fabricated by a conspiracy of traitors. He had legitimately refused to work with, citing Tobias by name, and further claiming that Gromma Rageborn had not only stolen his silver, but had subsequently coerced Tobias Graves into acting on her behalf through orc threat. The guild challenge, if accepted, would put the inquiry on hold and require a formal arbitration in Keswick, with both parties present. This meant Gromma coming out of clan territory into Keswick, which was a border town under common jurisdiction, with 5 bounty hunters waiting to the south of the forest, and a warrant that was on hold but not yet vacated. The message was read aloud in Dora Stonebeck's hall, in the common tongue and then in the clan tongue, and the silence afterward had a particular quality. Then Gromma said, "I will go." Dora Stonebeck spoke, and the translator said, "The elder advises against. The hold may not protect you within common jurisdiction." I know, Gromma said. He is trying to draw you out, Tobias said, because it was obvious. The arbitration in Keswick gives him a venue he controls. His guild connections are there. The arbitrators may be in his pocket. I know that too, she said. Then, Tobias. She turned to him, and her voice was level, but her eyes were fierce. If I hide here, he wins. The inquiry continues, but the guild challenge gives him grounds to muddy it indefinitely. He will keep the warrant active as long as I am in this territory, and he will keep the cloud over me, and every traitor he wants to threaten will see what happened to Gromma Rageborn, and know that the same could happen to them. She held his gaze. I did not steal from him. I am not going to let him make the world believe I did. He looked at her. He understood her completely. He had spent 2 years being quietly blacklisted from a post he had every right to trade at, swallowing it because speaking up seemed pointless, and he knew the specific exhaustion of it. She was done being patient with injustice, and he respected that to his marrow. Then we go to Keswick, he said. You do not have to, Gromma. He kept his voice as level as hers. You told those warriors at the boundary that I was yours. I told the court that I was your witness. Those things do not stop being true in Keswick. He paused. I go where you go. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked at Dora Stonebeck, and they exchanged something in the clan tongue that he did not follow, and Dora Stonebeck made a short sound that might have been approval, and reached out and gripped Gromma's forearm in the clan warrior's greeting, which was not something she had done since he arrived, and which Gromma returned with a straight spine and lifted chin. Then she looked at Tobias and said, Then we go to Keswick. Keswick was a hard 2-day ride, and Dora Stonebeck sent 2 clan warriors to accompany them. Not as an escort, she stipulated, but as observers, because a clan elder's right to observe an arbitration affecting a clan member was protected under the border treaty. This was a fine legal distinction, but a real one, and it meant the 2 warriors rode with them in plain sight down the highway to Keswick with clan marks on their forearms and chain links on their collars, and every trader and traveler they passed on the road moved to the far side and made room. The bounty hunters did not intercept them. Tobias suspected they had been told not to, by whoever had arranged the arbitration, because a confrontation on the road to an arbitration would look very bad for the guild. Keswick was a proper border town, walled in pale sandstone, with a market square and a guild hall and an inn on every corner, and the permanent simmering energy of a place where 3 kinds of people, frontier traders, common merchants, and orc clan members, rubbed up against each other in close quarters and mostly did not like it. Gromma walked through the market gate at the head of their small group with her chin up and her warrior's leathers immaculate and her hands loose at her sides, and the looks she got were the full spectrum from wary to hostile, and she met every one of them with the same contained, unimpressed dignity that made them look small for looking at her that way. The arbitration was set for the next morning, in the guild hall courtyard, which was traditional for public hearings under the border charter. This meant it was, technically, open to anyone who cared to attend. A lot of people cared to attend, as it turned out. Guild arbitrations involving warrants and clan members and counter charges of conspiracy and coercion were not a common event in Keswick, and by the time the court recorder opened proceedings the next morning, the courtyard was full traders, town residents, a dozen or so clan-adjacent orc workers from the market, guild members in their formal silver-pinned coats, and pressed against the back wall, the 5 bounty hunters who had been very quiet since the party's arrival. Harwick Combe was there. He was exactly as Tobias remembered: heavyset, oiled hair, waxed coat, the particular look of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted from rooms because he had spent money on their fixtures. He had 2 guild arbitrators beside him and a thin-faced clerk with a pile of ledgers, and he looked at Gromma when she entered with an expression of well-managed contempt that he was not quite managing well enough. He looked at Tobias and his eyes narrowed. He had not apparently expected Tobias to actually be there in person. Good, Tobias thought. The proceedings began. Combs' representative laid out the case first. the missing silver, the signed statements from Combs' employees, the conspiracy claim against Tobias and the other deponents, the coercion claim. It was polished and confident and clearly rehearsed, and it had the ring of something that had been effective in previous similar circumstances. And Tobias watched the arbitrators' faces and saw the particular careful neutrality of people who had been paid to be carefully neutral. Then the counter case began. Tobias stood up when his name was called and walked to the center of the courtyard, and he was aware of Gromma's eyes on him and the crowd pressing in on all sides and Combs' expression going from contempt to calculation. And he pulled out his own ledger, the small one he kept for personal accounts, worn smooth at the corners from years of handling, and he began to talk. He talked about dates. He talked about quantities. He talked about the specific prices he had been promised and the specific amounts he had been paid, and the specific conversations in which Combs had assured him the difference would be settled, and then settled nothing. He talked about the two other traders and read their depositions aloud, and they were specific and clear and corroborated each other in the way that real memory does, full of small inconsistencies of detail that all pointed to the same underlying truth. He talked about the pattern across multiple years, and he used the word pattern several times, deliberately, because the arbitrators were guild men and guild men understood that a pattern was not an accident. He was 3 minutes into this when one of the arbitrators shifted in his chair in a way that suggested he was beginning to find the proceedings uncomfortable. He was 7 minutes in when Combs' representative stood up to object on procedural grounds, and the presiding arbitrator, the more senior of the two, a sharp-eyed woman who had said very little so far, waved the objection down with a single small gesture that had the quality of long practice. He was 15 minutes in when Combs himself stood up. "This is fabrication," Combs said, loudly enough for the whole courtyard. "This man is a failed trader with a grudge and an alliance with an orc criminal, and nothing he says." "Sit down, Combs," the presiding arbitrator said, still in that quiet, practiced voice. Combs sat, but his face was red and his jaw was set, and something behind his eyes had shifted from confidence to calculation of a different kind, the calculation of someone who is working out how bad this might get. Tobias sat back down. Gromma's hand found his under the edge of the table, brief, firm, then gone. The testimony of Combs' employees came next, and under direct questioning from the presiding arbitrator, they began to contradict each other in small but significant ways, and then in larger ways, and the second employee, the younger of the two, a sandy-haired man who looked extremely unhappy to be where he was, eventually said, under sustained and courteous pressure, that he had been told what to write in the statement and had not personally witnessed the theft. The courtyard went very quiet. Combs said something to his representative in a sharp undertone. The representative said something back in an equally sharp undertone. Combs stood up again, and now he was not managing his expression at all. "This arbitration is irregular," he said. "The Orc Woman's clan representatives have no standing here under the common charter. The depositions are tainted by conspiracy, and I demand." Then Gromma Rageborn stood up. She did not raise her voice. She was not the kind of woman who needed to. She simply stood, which given her height and bearing meant that a considerable portion of the courtyard's attention snapped to her in the way that attention snaps to something that radiates genuine authority, and she looked at Harwick Combs for a long, still moment. And then she said in a clear, carrying voice that covered the whole courtyard without effort, "I challenge you, Harwick Combs, under the Border Charter's third covenant to account for the silver. Not my guilt. Your accounting. Open the post books for the 30 days surrounding the date of your claim and let the arbitrators read them." Dead silence. The presiding arbitrator turned sharply to look at her. "The third covenant," Gromma said, "gives any accused party the right to demand an audit of the accuser's accounts in the period of the claimed theft, if the theft is of currency or transferable value. This is an old right. It is in the charter." It does not require clan standing or guild standing to invoke. She met the arbitrator's eyes. I am invoking it. Combs' representative was on his feet again, speaking very quickly, but the presiding arbitrator was already holding up a hand, and the look on her face was not the look of carefully managed neutrality anymore. It was the look of someone who had been presented with a legal instrument she was required to honor and knew it. The third covenant right, she said slowly, is indeed in the Border Charter. Article 14, Section 3, she looked at Combe. We will require access to the Dunridge Post accounts. You will not, Combe said, and his voice cracked on the last word, which was the most telling thing that had happened all morning. We will, she said, or this arbitration will be halted pending a full court inquiry with compulsory disclosure, and the warrant will be vacated in the interim. She held his gaze with the serenity of a woman who had been in this chair for 20 years and had seen everything. Your choice, Mr. Combe. The courtyard was completely silent. Everyone was looking at Combe. Tobias was looking at Gromma. She was not looking at him. She was looking at Combe with an expression of iron-calm certainty, and he thought in that moment that she was the most magnificent person he had ever seen in his life, and he had thought similar things several times in the past 10 days, but this was the clearest it had ever been. Combe made the wrong choice. He tried to leave. He actually stood up, gathered his coat, said something about consulting his records in Dunridge before proceeding, and made for the courtyard gate. And one of the clan warriors who had been a silent observer against the wall simply stepped into the gateway and stood there, arms crossed, with the kind of stillness that made it very clear that the word simply was doing considerable work in that sentence. Combe stopped. The presiding arbitrator said quietly, Mr. Combe, sit down. He sat down. And something in the way he sat down was different from all the previous sitting down, and Tobias recognized the difference, because he had sat in that chair himself, 2 years ago, at a table in Dunridge Post when Combe had told him the difference in the honey contract would not be paid. It was the chair of a man who has run out of moves. It took 6 hours. Comb's factor books were produced reluctantly, in pieces, under sustained arbitrator pressure, and the presiding arbitrator and a guild auditor she summoned from the hall reviewed them together through the afternoon, and by the time the light went golden in the courtyard, it was clear what the books showed, which was that the 40 silver marks in question had been transferred from the strongbox to a personal account of Combs the week before the date he claimed they were stolen, and that this transfer had been recorded in a different hand from the standard ledger entries, and that the 2 employees who had signed statements were on Combs' personal payroll rather than the guild post. Payroll. The warrant was vacated formally at sundown, in front of the still-assembled courtyard, because the presiding arbitrator had the good instincts to understand that something this significant required a public resolution to match the public accusation. She read the vacating statement in a clear, carrying voice, and stated for the record that Gromma Rageborn bore no guilt in the matter of the Dunridge Post theft, and that the charge was determined to be fraudulent in origin. Combe was removed from his factor position pending full guild inquiry. The 5 bounty hunters, Tobias noticed, had quietly left sometime around hour 3. Guild men who had pursued a fraudulent warrant tended to prefer not to be noticed at the moment the fraud became official. When the arbitrator finished reading, the courtyard made noise. It was a complicated noise, not exactly a cheer, because cheering at a guild proceeding was not done, but a kind of generalized shift in the air, a release, the sound of a crowd that had been holding tension and had finally put it down. Gromma stood in the middle of the courtyard and let it happen around her, and she was still and quiet and her chin was up, and then she turned and found Tobias with her eyes across the crowd, and her expression was not triumph exactly. It was something deeper than triumph. Something that had been waiting to surface for a long time. He crossed to her. He did not think about it. He just went. She met him in the middle of the courtyard in front of everyone in the golden late light, and she took his face in both hands, large hands, warm and strong, and kissed him the way she had the night before he left the Highland, but without the quiet and without the privacy. And a different sort of sound went through the courtyard, one with a different quality entirely, startled and shifting and ultimately settling into something that sounded, he thought, like acceptance. When she pulled back, she was looking at him with those dark green eyes very close, and she said, quietly enough that it was just for him, "Thank you. You did that," he said. "The third covenant, I did not even know that was in the charter." "I spent the last week reading the charter very carefully," she said. "I had time while I was waiting for you to come back." "You had planned it," he said, with something that was caught between admiration and disbelief. "I hoped for the opportunity," she said. "You created the opportunity by bringing the depositions and making the inquiry real enough that the arbitration had to be genuine." She did not let go of his face. "We did it." "We did it," he agreed. She smiled at him fully, with nothing held back, and it was the same wonderful thing it always was, but more so. Behind them, the presiding arbitrator was concluding the formalities. Around them, the crowd was dispersing, and the clan warriors were moving toward them, and Dora Stoneback's message rider was already being dispatched northward, and the machinery of resolution was grinding forward in its unglamorous but necessary way. All of that was real and mattered, and would need dealing with in the hours and days ahead. But for that one moment, in the courtyard, in the gold light, it was just them. They stayed in Keswick 3 more days to complete the formal deposition for the guild inquiry against Combe, which was now a much larger affair than a simple warrant dispute, encompassing potential fraud across multiple contracts over several years. Tobias gave his account again, and Aldrich Vess and Merritt Halst sent additional depositions by messenger, and the guild's own records team from the regional office arrived and descended on Combs' books with the enthusiasm of people who had suspected something was wrong for a long time and were finally being given permission to look. Gromma gave her account with the same contained precision she brought to everything, and the presiding arbitrator listened to it and made notes, and at the end looked at her for a quiet moment and said, "You were remarkably patient with this." "I was waiting for the right moment," Gromma said. "Most people in your position would have been considerably less composed." "Most people," Gromma said, with a glance at Tobias that he felt warm all the way through, "did not have good reason to be patient." The nights in Keswick were at the inn, which was a solid timber and plaster building near the market gate with small, private rooms and a reliable hearth, and a proprietor who took their coin without apparent feelings about who they were. The first night, after the arbitration, they sat in the common room long past the other patrons and talked with the ease of people who had crossed a significant threshold together and were still discovering what lay on the other side of it. The second night, she came to his room. She knocked, which was not strictly necessary given that it was clearly going to happen and they both knew it, but she did it anyway because she was, under all the warrior's directness, someone who believed in asking clearly for what she wanted. He opened the door and she stood there in the firelight of the corridor and looked at him and said, "I would like to stay," with the same frank calm she brought to everything, and he stood back from the door and let her in, and the fire in the small hearth was warm, and the night outside was cold, and the conversation that followed was much less about words than everything that had come before it. It was not a frantic thing, for all the heat of it. It had the quality of something that had been building quietly and was finally allowed to move at its own pace, and she was entirely herself in it, steady and warm, and choosing him with her whole attention in a way that he had never before experienced from another person. The feeling of being fully and unhurriedly seen, of mattering completely to someone who had no obligation to make him matter. It undid something in him that had been knotted for years, something he had not had a name for but recognized clearly in the unraveling of it. Afterward she lay with her arm across his chest and her chin on her forearm and looked at him in the low firelight with an expression that was completely open. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I am glad the hunters chased me to your river," she said. He laughed quietly, and the laugh moved through both of them. "That is a very orc thing to say about a bad situation." "Among the Rageborn," she said, We say that the worst paths lead to the best places. Our war captain used to say it. I thought it was sentimental. She looked at him. I am reconsidering. Good, he said, and pulled her closer. And she came without resistance, which was remarkable for a woman who resisted everything by default. The third morning in Keswick, the guild inquiry manager formally confirmed that the new warrant being considered, this one against Harwick Combe, would proceed, and that all parties who had given evidence were free to go. Gromma's name was cleared in writing with a guild stamp, and the document was given to her in a sealed tube, and she looked at it for a moment before putting it in her belt pouch. "It is real," Tobias said. "Yes," she said, "it is." They rode out of Keswick in the early morning, the two clan warriors ahead, the horses steady on the road south, and the sky above the sandstone walls was the particular pale blue of a sky that has finished raining and is working out what to do next. "South first," Tobias said. "I need to check the hives." She was riding beside him, which she had not done on the way in, having been more watchful then, less able to give attention to anything sideways. "Yes," she said, "and I need to see these famous bees." "You saw the hives when you dried your clothes by my hearth." "I saw boxes," she said. "I want to see the actual work, what you do, how it goes." He looked at her. "You want to learn the hives." "I want to understand what your life is," she said simply. "I have been telling you about mine for weeks. It seems fair." He thought about this. "What does understanding my life mean for yours?" She was quiet for a moment. The horses walked. The clan warriors were far enough ahead to be out of earshot. The road south was empty in the early morning, dew still on the grass at its edges, the sky enormous and clear. "Among the Rageborn," she said. "When a warrior says that someone is theirs and means it, not as a convenience, not for the boundary guards, it is not a small thing. It does not go away when the emergency goes away." She glanced at him sideways. "I meant it at the boundary and after. I mean it now." "I know," he said. "Do you?" "Yes," he said, "because I feel the same way. I have felt the same way since the waterfall." She looked at him and the corner of her mouth moved, and then the whole smile came, and it was still the most wonderful thing, and it always would be. "Then I am coming south," she said, "to see the bees, and after that we will determine what makes sense." "What do you think will make sense?" he asked. "I think," she said with great care, "that a frontier homestead on the edge of Orc clan territory is an interesting place for a Rageborn warrior with nowhere particular to be. There is no Rageborn warband requiring my return. Dora's two warriors will go back. I am not their charge." A pause. "I am not anyone's charge but my own." "Except that you told the boundary warriors you were mine," he said. "And you told the bounty hunters you were my witness," she said. "So we are apparently each other's charge in different ways." She looked at the road ahead. "I find I do not mind that." "I find I very much do not mind that," he said. She reached across the space between their horses and covered his hand on the rein with hers, briefly, as she had in the forest the first time. And this time she did not take it back as quickly. And they rode that way for a while in the morning light, the road unfolding south. The homestead looked exactly as he had left it, the fieldstone walls, the cedar hive boxes in their rows, the sheep drifting in the south paddock, the root cellar door still properly latched against the autumn chill. He had half expected to come back and find something wrong, the way things go wrong when you leave them. But the hives were quiet and calm, and the stones were dry, and the smell of warm wax was on the air even in the late season cool, and it was home, unambiguously and completely. Gromma dismounted and stood at the edge of the hive yard and looked at it the way she had looked at everything he had shown her, with full attention, cataloging, letting it be what it was without judgment. "It is a good place," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is." She walked to the nearest hive and bent slightly to look at the entrance slot, where the late-season bees were moving in and out in their slow autumn rhythm, unhurried, purposeful. "They do not know anything happened," she said. 3 weeks of your life turned over and they are just here." "Bees do not keep track of human disasters," he agreed. "It is one of their better qualities." She stood up straight and looked at the full row of hive boxes, and he saw her doing something he recognized. She was imagining something. Not planning, not calculating. Imagining the way a person imagines when they are considering whether they fit somewhere. "How many colonies do you need to make the hive yard viable?" she asked. "At current prices, 12. 22 is better. I have been trying to get to 30, but the Highland margin expansion has been slow." "The Highland margin," she said. "The eastern ridge." "Yes, I know that ridge." She turned and looked at him. "The Rageborn used to summer camp on the plateau above it. There are flowers there in June that last into August, old-growth flowers. I do not know what they are called in the common tongue, but they are deep blue and very sweet-smelling." "Goreth bellflower," he said. "It only grows at altitude. The honey from that pollen is—" He stopped. "I have never been able to get colonies up there. The ridge trail is too steep for the boxes, and there was no one to help carry them." She looked at him steadily. He looked at her. "I can carry a hive box up a ridge trail," she said. "You are a Rageborn warrior," he said. "Yes, and I have apparently decided to be a Rageborn warrior who helps with bee colonies on the Highland Ridge." She held his gaze. "If there is room." "There is room," he said, and his voice came out lower than he intended. "There is all the room in the world." The first hard frost came 3 weeks later, settling white and thick on the hive covers and the stone walls and the paddock grass, and Tobias was up before it fully lifted, moving through the hive yard in the gray pre-dawn with the hive tool in his hand, checking covers, listening at entrances. And Gromma was with him, having learned the morning round with the focused efficiency she brought to every new skill, moving carefully and without sudden gesture in the way he had shown her. The bees utterly unbothered by her presence in a way that had surprised her and quietly delighted him. They had made the hive barn into something more than a workspace. There was a second bed frame in the back room now, though it went mostly unused, and the long barn table had her clan weapons laid out along one end and his waxworking tools along the other. And it felt the way shared spaces feel when two people have occupied them long enough to stop being careful about which part belongs to whom. She had written to Dora Stoneback about the arrangement, formally, in the clan tongue, which she told him was necessary because a Rageborn warrior declaring residency outside clan territory required a clan elder acknowledgement for the record. Dora Stoneback had written back a short reply that Gromma translated as, "Do not neglect your forms," and then, on the last line, something that Gromma said was an old clan phrase and did not have a direct equivalent but meant, roughly, "Go well and do not be lonely." "She approves," Tobias said. "She would not say it that plainly," Gromma said. "But yes." The frost lay on the ground in the early morning, and they moved through the hive yard in the gray light, and the bees hummed softly in their winter clusters behind the cedar walls, alive and warm and patient, and the sky above the forest was beginning to turn the particular pale color that comes just before the sun breaks, not yet gold, not still gray, something in between. He paused at the 20th hive and stood still for a moment, and Gromma, 3 steps ahead, stopped and looked back. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, "just looking at this." She came back to stand beside him. She stood close, as she always did, with the easy comfort of two people who have stopped accounting for the space between them. He looked at the hive yard, the rows of cedar boxes in the frost-white morning, the stone house with the chimney smoke just beginning, the forest edge dark and tall beyond the paddock fence, the sky turning. He felt the waste-on warmth of the moment in his chest the same way he had felt it when she first put the stone in his palm. "Say the whole thought," she said softly. He turned and looked at her. Her breath was white in the cold air. Her eyes were the color of deep moss after rain, as they always were. She was wearing his second coat over her warrior's leathers because the frost required it, and she looked completely herself inside it, which was a thing about her that he had come to love particularly. She was always entirely, unmistakably herself, regardless of what was around her. "I was thinking," he said, "that this is exactly what I want. Everything I am looking at, including you." He paused. "Especially you." She looked at him for a moment, and then she put her arm around his back and pulled him against her side, and they stood there together in the frost-white morning and watched the sky finish turning gold, and the bees hummed their low winter note behind the cedar walls, and the sheep moved in the paddock, and the chimney smoke rose straight in the still air. "I am not going anywhere," she said. "I know," he said. "Good," she said. "Stop looking surprised by it." He laughed, and she laughed too, and the sound of it went out across the frost-quiet yard and into the forest edge in the pale morning, and the bees hummed on, steady and warm and utterly unbothered by anything at all. The guild inquiry concluded 6 weeks later, its findings sent in a sealed courier packet to every party who had given evidence. Harwick Combe was removed from the Dunridge Post factor position with full loss of guild standing, required to repay with interest every trader he had demonstrably shorted, which list included Tobias Graves, Aldrich Vess, Merritt Halst, and 11 others who had come forward once the inquiry was public, and barred from further factor appointments within the Border Guild system. The 2 employees who had signed false statements against Gromma received censures rather than criminal charges in exchange for their cooperation, which Tobias thought was somewhat lenient and Gromma thought was irrelevant. "What matters," she said, when the packet arrived and they read it together at the kitchen table, "is that it is finished." "It is finished," he agreed. She set the papers down and looked at them for a moment, and he saw in her face the particular settling of something that has been carried for a long time and is finally being put down, not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer needed to be held. "Dunridge Post will have a new factor by spring," she said. "The Market Road will be open again. Better prices for honey," he said. "Better prices for everything." She looked up at him, "and no reason to take the 3-day road to Greenford." "No," he agreed. "Though I may go anyway sometimes, I like Greenford." She looked at him with that sideways look. "I know you like the old honey hall there. They keep 3 centuries of honey records in that hall. It is historically significant." "It is extremely old jars," she said, but she was smiling. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned her palm up and closed her fingers around his, easy and certain, the way she had been doing it for weeks now, the way that had stopped feeling like something new and had started feeling like something that had always been true. "I want to put 3 more colonies on the Highland Ridge in spring," he said. "The bellflower patch you showed me would support them." "I told you it would," she said. "You did," he agreed. "You were right." "I am frequently right," she said. "Yes, it is very convenient." She squeezed his hand. "And I want to go back to Keswick for the spring market. Dora is sending a trade delegation and I told her we might come." He raised his eyebrows. "We?" "Yes," she said. "We." He looked at her and she looked back, and the kitchen was warm and the fire was steady, and outside the frost was beginning to melt in the morning sun, dripping from the hive covers in bright drops, and the bees were waking up to a clear day. "We," he said, and the word felt the way the waistone had felt in his palm the first time she put it there, warm, alive, pointing somewhere. "Stop repeating it," she said, "and put the kettle on." He stood up and put the kettle on, and she remained at the table with her chin on her hand, watching him with those deep green eyes, and the small smile that he had come to understand was her natural resting expression when she was somewhere she wanted to be, with someone she had chosen deliberately and completely. He put out 2 cups. He spooned honey into both, the good batch, the heather batch, dark and heady. He carried them to the table and sat back down. She wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the steam rising from it, and then she looked at him. "It was the waterfall," she said. He tilted his head. "What?" "When you did not run," she said, "or shout. When you just stayed and helped." She looked at her cup, then back at him. "I had been running from hunters for 3 days. I had been sleeping badly and moving fast and thinking about whether I would reach clan territory before the warrant caught me. And I came through the undergrowth, and there was a human man kneeling at the river filling a water skin, and he looked up at me, and I could see him working out whether to be afraid or not, and he decided not to, and he helped me." She paused. "No one had helped me for a very long time." He thought about the waterfall, the cold and the noise and the mist, her hand on his wrist, the way she had not let go. "I did not want you to let go of my hand," he said. She looked at him. "Under the falls," he said. "I was aware that you had not let go and I did not want you to." He met her eyes. "I noticed it right away. It seemed significant." "It was," she said, "for me also." "Why did you not let go?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because," she said at last, "it felt like holding on to something I did not know I had lost." He looked at her across the table, in the warm kitchen, in the frost-bright morning, and she looked back. And the kettle settled into its low singing, and the bees moved in their boxes outside, and the daylight came through the window in long, clear bars. He said, "Do not let go again." "Never," she said. Simply, without drama, with the particular weight of a word said by someone who means it so completely that it does not require any additional support. Never. He reached across and she reached across and they held on, 2 hands across a kitchen table, as the winter morning came fully into the world around them, clean and cold and bright, and the hive yard hummed its low, constant note, and the fire held its warmth, and nothing in the world required anything from them for one clear, held moment except to be exactly where they were. Outside, the last of the frost melted from the cedar hive covers and ran down in bright threads to the cold ground, and the bees, warming now, began to fly, the first flights of a winter-thawed morning, small and purposeful and entirely certain of where they were going. In the kitchen, Tobias Graves and Gromma Rageborn drank their tea with honey and talked about spring.